What's going on, everybody? Welcome back, and I'm glad you're here. We're back with another 1911 video, and today we are going to be talking about springs yet again. So in my first video, I explained some things, apparently not detailed enough, because boy, the amount of confusion that exists on this topic is surprising, and I'm trying really hard to be nice. It is it's a bit messy, and people have thrown some comments in on that video and others that are shocking, and I don't quite know where they got them. So we're going to talk about recoil springs and mainsprings. Now, before we start, I want to say one thing very clearly, that look, these ideas are not my own. I am standing on the shoulders of giants. Okay, I'm taking this information from current pistol builders that have been doing this for decades, but then going back generations of pistol builders, and really all the way back to the inventor himself, John Moses Browning. So the ideas I'm putting forward are not just random ideas that I thought of because I want something to say. These things are born out over generations of pistol use with the 1911, and then for me personally, I have seen these to be true over tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of rounds over the past 15, 16 years. So the information I'm giving you is so vastly proven that someone's anecdotal response to this, listen, I mean this respectfully, I just don't take seriously. Let's start with recoil springs. So I recommend a Wilson Combat or a Wolf 16-pound recoil spring. Now, very specifically, I recommend those brands and that poundage because they are made to proper spec. Now, where do I get that proper spec from? If you go all the way back to the 1912 handbook on the 1911, this was spelled out for us. Now, what a lot of people do is they're going to go research this and they can't find it. And the reason is because in that book, it does not call out the word 16 pound. What it does instead is it gives you very painfully specific specifications on what a proper recoil spring is. Now, we measure it today in pounds, but unfortunately, we've drifted away from those very specific specifications. And yes, we might have 16 pounds at full recoil cycle, but there's more than just 16 pounds at full cycle that we're looking for. So what are those original specs? A recoil spring of 34 coils. The wire gauge is listed as 0.045 steel gauged wire. It also calls out that when the slide is at full recoil cycle or lockback, that spring should measure 1 5/8 inches compressed at full cycle. So when you start spelling all these details out, you get a very specific spring. And this is what a lot of people don't understand about factory springs. They say that, oh, I went on their website and it says that they come with a 16-pound spring. But then I show them pictures like this that show a quote-unquote factory 16-pound spring from Springfield versus a Wilson Combat, and don't you see something different? Yes, one is very short. The wire gauge is not the same as a Wilson Combat recoil spring. And what does this get us? How does this translate? So what you really are after is you want 16 pounds of recoil spring weight at 3/4 of your recoil cycle. Why is that? Because when the slide is returning, 3/4 of your recoil cycle is about right there. Now, what's happening at this point of the recoil cycle? You're feeding, okay? So if we have an undersprung recoil spring, when it gets to this crucial point where this cartridge is needing to make a turn into the chamber, we don't have enough weight forward, especially under dirty conditions and dry conditions and maybe not properly lubricated and all these things. And then we wonder why the gun doesn't work. Another thing this contributes to is longevity. With those shorter springs, you are just not going to get the same life out of the spring that you would as a proper spring. A good recoil spring should last you no less than 5,000 rounds. No problem. So somebody might roll in sideways and say, yeah, well, my stock recoil springs lasted me the past 1,000 rounds. Maybe even you might throw in and say 5,000 rounds. But I will tell you, your action is going to be loose. Your feeding is going to be on a razor's edge of reliability. I guarantee it. Here's something else a proper recoil spring gets you. Because that spring is longer, you're also going to have a better lockup, which is going to contribute to accuracy. So when you have a weak spring and you can literally grab the top of the barrel hood and push from the bottom of the trigger guard and just pinch, there are some springs that are so light that the gun, you can actually drop the barrel hood and retract the slide because the spring is so pathetic. So now I hope you're starting to understand how many things this recoil spring touches. It's not just recoil. It's lockup, it's accuracy, it's feeding, it's everything. So much is contributed to by the proper recoil spring. Now, there's also people, and I'm going to just touch on this very briefly, there's also people who are clutching their pearls and are aghast that one might have to buy a pistol and suddenly change parts. Oh no! I would just like to point out to you the part that I'm suggesting you change. It cost $8. Now, I could understand that criticism if I was saying you need to spend $400 to get your gun running correctly after you purchase it. Yeah, that would be insane. Guys, I'm talking $8. Let's double it and say it was $16. This is a ridiculous, hyperbolic, silly, childish argument. Now, I just want to close the recoil spring portion with this statement. This is not just me, as I've said, saying that guns on the factory and semi-custom level are undersprung. If you don't believe me, here's Jason Burton in a recent Guns and Ammo interview talking about some of the problems you run into with factory pistols. And guess which one he brought up?
There's other little things, guns that might not be sprung correctly or guns that have heavy triggers or hard edges on them. And those things will, of course, impact the success a shooter may or may not have with the gun.
So the people who just want to fight this because they don't want it to be true, you have to contend with over 100 years of standard doctrine around the 1911, and including every single pistol smith that I can cite off the top of my head agrees with this assessment. Undersprung guns for a proper standard 1911 are a problem. Now, let's talk about the significantly less crucial, but still important to understand, mainspring. So the mainspring, its whole job is to apply upward and opposing pressure on the hammer. So if we look at how this works, the hammer is sitting in the frame of your pistol like so, okay? So you have your hammer, and then you have what's called your hammer strut. This is your mainspring housing. All it does is house a main spring, which is what you see right here, okay? So the mainspring goes inside the mainspring housing with a plug and cap. Then you have a little pin that kind of captures all that in there, and it sits like this in the pistol, okay? And then you have your hammer, and that strut actually sits down in the little cap on the mainspring housing, just like this, okay? Now, when you pull this hammer back, that strut pushes down into the mainspring housing, okay? So the mainspring's job is to apply constant pressure upward on the hammer strut. But just like the recoil spring, the mainspring has more than one job. It doesn't merely make the hammer fall. It also affects how the trigger feels. These tiny little hooks right here on the hammer are what your sear grabs onto like that, okay? And when you press the trigger, that sear is popping off of those hooks. But the more upward pressure you have from the mainspring, the harder the trigger pull will be to then break that hammer off of the sear. So what a lot of companies do, and what I criticize very often, is in order to reduce the trigger pull weight on the trigger, they reduce the mainspring weight, because then there's less pressure to get that sear to pop off the hammer hooks. Now, is this the end of the world? No. but it's just not proper. Now, why does proper matter? Well, again, we're going to go all the way back to the original design. The original design was for this pistol to be carried with a round in the chamber and the hammer down, which is why we have a wide spur hammer. You would draw the pistol out, cock the hammer, and go to town. Okay, very simple. Now, back in those days, they understood that with the hammer back, you have an opportunity for dirt and debris to get down into your action. If I look down in here, I have direct access to the most important, crucial components of the pistol. Your hammer hooks, your sear, your disconnector, the heart of the pistol is exposed with the hammer back, which is why they suggested the hammer be carried in the down position. Now, nowadays, this is considered very unsafe, but you have to understand, with a properly weighted spring of 23 pounds, that hammer is forced to the face of where the firing pin sits. So you can't easily at all or accidentally smack this hammer back far enough for it to gain any momentum and drop on the firing pin. If you could, it would catch on your first cock of the sear. So we have the half cock position, which is right here. So if the hammer did get pulled back where it would be a threat to having enough momentum to actuate the firing pin, it would catch on the first cock. Okay, you see how this was geniusly designed. So with the hammer down, we are actually guarding the action and the firing pin from having an issue. Now again, I'm not advocating for this condition of carry. I'm not advocating that at all. I personally would not do it, but I'm just telling you that was the original intent and why the associated spring was what it was. Here's another function that the mainspring has. It also serves as a reliability function. So when you have a really light spring, imagine when the gun gets dirty, maybe you do have a little debris around your firing pin, it just doesn't have enough force to get past all that dry grit and dirt and actually hit the firing pin. And this is something characteristic of the day. Every vintage gun that I own, my 1942 H&R single break, my 1941 Mosin, my 1981 Makarov, my 1909 Winchester, the model 1907, all my vintage guns have a very stout and crisp trigger. And this was a pretty common doctrine of the day, is you had hammers hitting with authority. Why? Because they want to make sure that thing goes off. They wanted to get through all the grit and the grime. They want to avoid light primer strikes, all of it. But see, again, today, we don't think the way they did back then in a very utilitarian way. Now everything's got to be about feel. It's all got to feel good, right? And so we make everything super light and gentle, and it appeals to that side of the house more than it does function, and then we wonder why the 1911 doesn't work properly. So that is the function of the mainspring. Now, if your gun came stock with a 19-pound mainspring, which is very common for factory pistols and even semi-custom, is that the end of the world? Not at all. Your gun will run fine. If you want to leave it alone, I don't think that's as much of a deal breaker as the recoil spring is. In fact, I will tell you, if you like a smoother action, so right now this has a full 23-pound recoil spring, or a mainspring rather. When I go to pull the slide back, I'm fighting against this hammer. So the initial pull is pretty stiff, okay? Not the end of the world, but it's a factor. Now, the Kimber, this has a lighter hammer spring. And this one is dramatically easier to pull back. Why? Because I have less pressure being forced on the hammer strut, so that hammer is easy to push out of the way and pull the slide back. Now, personally, I'm not a huge fan of the mainspring being the first choice to get a lighter feeling trigger that factories will put in their guns. Personally, I think there's much better ways to go about getting that lighter trigger, and it's just having the rest of the gun be set up a little bit better. Unfortunately, that takes a skilled person and it takes time, which is not something that factories want to pay for. So the easier thing to do, throw in a lighter spring and call it a day. So I just wanted to make a video reiterating some points, making some finer points about recoil springs and mainsprings. And again, I want you guys to understand these are not my ideas. Now, I stand by them and I believe them wholeheartedly. And as of yet, no one has made a good case for why what I'm saying is incorrect, other than a shrug of the shoulder and saying, well, mine works. To me, that's not an argument. Okay, if you want to make an argument, give me some data that's provable over time through multiple sources. What I'm presenting to you goes all the way back to the original 1911, has been proven all the way up through generations until present day. And so that's where I'm coming from with this. These are not my ideas. These are ideas of geniuses and giants on which their shoulders I stand. So I hope that was informative for you guys. I'm going to say it again. When you get your pistol, no matter what pistol it is, put a Wilson Combat 16-pound recoil spring in there. That's essential. I think it's as essential as even oiling the gun in the first place. And that is going to give you a properly functioning gun if it's a properly built gun, and assuming you've done the proper magazines and lubrication and all the other stuff required. And it's also going to give you long life of that spring. It's not something you're going to have to think about often, and it costs $8. Come on. Okay, that's what I've got for you guys. I hope that was helpful. We'll see you on the next one.